Mark Halloway laughed as Jason Cole lay dying on the highway, a moment that would shock an entire city and expose the dark side of power, authority, and recklessness. Detective Mark Halloway had always been known for his fearlessness, but that evening, his recklessness took a deadly turn. The sun was dipping behind the horizon, casting long shadows across the busy highway that sliced through the outskirts of the city. The roar of engines filled the air as drivers hustled to get home, but one motorcycle cut through the traffic with remarkable speed. Jason Cole, 28, leaned into every curve, his black leather jacket glinting under the fading sunlight. He loved the thrill, the sense of freedom, the wind slapping his face as the city blurred around him. In a police cruiser not far behind, Halloway's vehicle weaved between cars with calculated impatience. Though off-duty, he remained on high alert, eyes scanning the highway for anything out of the ordinary. He had been driving like this for hours, pushing his vehicle to its limits, testing both his reflexes and his sense of control over the road. When Jason shot past him, the thrill ignited something darker in Halloway, a combination of irritation and fascination. The chase that followed lasted only seconds but would have consequences that lasted a lifetime. The collision was sudden. Jason's motorcycle clipped the side of Halloway's cruiser at an angle that sent him soaring through the air. Chrome and steel clattered against asphalt, sparks flying in a grim display of destruction. His body landed hard several feet from the crumpled bike, which slid violently across the lane before coming to a stop. Passers-by froze, some stepping out of their cars, horror etched across their faces. It was not just the violence of the accident that shocked them, it was Halloway's reaction. Instead of rushing to help, he stood over the fallen motorcyclist, a twisted smirk forming as he surveyed the chaos. Paramedics arrived within minutes, their sirens slicing through the night, yet Halloway remained almost motionless, his presence more chilling than the wreck itself. Witnesses would later describe a laughter that seemed to emerge from nowhere, cold and detached, echoing across the empty stretch of road. Jason struggled to breathe, his life slipping away with every passing second, and Halloway's amusement did not waver. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows over the scene, and in that moment, the city glimpsed a terrifying contradiction. A man sworn to protect and serve, standing unmoved as another bled on the asphalt. Social media quickly captured fragments of the tragedy. Blurry photos and shaky videos of the scene spread across platforms within hours, sparking outrage and confusion. People demanded answers, struggling to understand how a law enforcement officer could witness a man dying before him and react with such cold indifference. That night, the city learned that even someone trained to uphold the law could be capable of unimaginable darkness. As the investigation into the crash unfolded, the city began to realize there was more to Halloway than anyone had imagined. On paper, he had a clean record, commendations for bravery, years of service, and few complaints formally documented. But a deeper look into his career revealed a pattern of behavior that had been quietly tolerated, dismissed, or ignored. Colleagues whispered about his obsession with control, his tendency to push boundaries, and an unsettling enjoyment of chaos. A few had even noted that he seemed to thrive on the fear or discomfort of others, a trait they had assumed was just a quirk of his personality until now. Investigators examined the accident scene with meticulous attention to detail. Skid marks, tire imprints, and the trajectory of Jason's body suggested that the collision might not have been accidental. Forensic experts reconstructed the crash in slow motion, noting how Halloway's cruiser had accelerated slightly before impact and how the angle of contact had thrown Jason in a violent arc. The evidence contradicted Halloway's initial claims of distraction and suggested a troubling level of intent or recklessness. Every small detail, the positioning of the motorcycle, the pattern of debris, the distance Jason was thrown, added to a narrative that was chillingly precise. Authorities also dug into Halloway's personal life. His social media presence revealed an obsession with speed, with videos of daring maneuvers and near misses posted and shared in a private circle of followers who celebrated risk. There were photos of car accidents, some featuring law enforcement vehicles, often accompanied by captions that hinted at amusement rather than concern. The deeper investigators looked, the more it became clear that Halloway's fascination with danger was not limited to his work but extended into a private, almost ritualistic thrill-seeking. Meanwhile, the community was reeling. Jason's death had been sudden, senseless, and public, and the revelation that a police officer might have contributed intentionally struck a nerve. Social media became a battleground of outrage, with users dissecting the timeline, sharing CCTV footage, and demanding answers. News outlets amplified the story, exposing the gap between Halloway's polished public image and the darker reality that now emerged. Each new detail, the laughter at the scene, the reckless driving patterns, the obsession with control, added fuel to the fire, leaving the city struggling to reconcile trust in law enforcement with the terrifying possibility of betrayal. Internal Affairs quietly began reaching out to officers who had interacted with Halloway in the past. A few stepped forward, recounting moments that now seemed ominous in hindsight: traffic stops where he appeared to relish intimidation, high-speed chases that stretched protocol to the edge, and comments made in passing that hinted at a dangerous fascination with power over life and death. Piece by piece, the investigation revealed a pattern of behavior that transformed a tragic accident into a disturbing portrait of a man capable of cruelty, deliberate or not, that the city had never truly seen before. As the investigation into the crash deepened, more witnesses began to step forward, painting a picture that was increasingly troubling. One street vendor recalled seeing Halloway's cruiser cruising the highway for hours before the accident, moving in and out of lanes with unusual precision, almost as if he were studying the traffic, waiting for a mistake. Another motorist remembered the officer flashing his lights aggressively at slower drivers, creating moments of panic that seemed to thrill him rather than serve any traffic purpose. Each new account suggested Halloway's actions were deliberate, rather than the result of a distracted or panicked driver. Meanwhile, forensic analysis of the scene provided further evidence of the severity and violence of the crash. The angle at which Jason had been struck, the trajectory of his body, and the placement of the motorcycle indicated that Halloway's vehicle had not simply grazed him in an accident. The collision had amplified the force, causing injuries far more catastrophic than a typical roadside crash. Medical examiners noted that Jason's wounds were consistent with a deliberate hit at high speed, raising difficult questions about whether Halloway had acted with intent or recklessness bordering on maliciousness. The investigation also uncovered disturbing details about Halloway's behavior in the hours following the crash. Security footage from nearby gas stations and toll booths showed him driving slowly past the accident scene, glancing back repeatedly, and then circling the area in a manner that seemed almost ritualistic. His expressions, captured in brief moments on camera, reflected amusement rather than concern, freezing the horror of the scene in stark, undeniable detail. This evidence contradicted the initial statements he had given to Internal Affairs and local authorities, creating a web of inconsistencies that investigators would not overlook. The public, meanwhile, had become obsessed with the case. Amateur sleuths scoured social media and mapped the highway, analyzing angles, speeds, and timing. Discussions and theories proliferated online, some reasonable, some speculative, but all fixated on the unsettling image of a law enforcement officer laughing as a man lay dying. The narrative of Jason's death became more than a single tragic incident. It symbolized the potential for abuse of authority and the fragility of trust in those meant to protect the public. Internal Affairs officers finally found colleagues willing to break their silence. They shared stories of reckless behavior, past traffic incidents, and a pattern of intimidation that now fit into a larger, darker puzzle. Each piece of testimony added weight to the possibility that the crash was not an isolated accident, but part of a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for years. The investigation was no longer just about the death of Jason Cole. It had become an unraveling of a man's character and a frightening glimpse into what happens when authority is left unchecked. The courtroom became the stage for a confrontation between evidence and denial, and every detail of the crash was scrutinized under a relentless spotlight. Prosecutors reconstructed the night of the accident with painstaking care, layering CCTV footage, forensic analysis, and eyewitness accounts to present a chilling picture of what had happened. Tire marks traced across the asphalt, combined with the angle of Jason Cole's flight through the air, suggested that Halloway's cruiser had accelerated slightly just before impact, intensifying the severity of the collision. Each piece of evidence told a story of force and control, a calculated choreography that contradicted Halloway's claims of distraction and accident. Experts walked the jury through the physics of the crash, showing how the placement of debris and the trajectory of the motorcycle aligned with deliberate recklessness. The medical examiner testified about the extent of Jason's injuries, explaining how the impact caused blunt force trauma inconsistent with an ordinary accident. The more the evidence unfolded, the more the courtroom felt the weight of what had occurred. Every slide, every diagram, every frame of video contributed to an image of a man who not only failed to prevent a tragedy, but seemed to derive a dark satisfaction from the outcome. Outside the courtroom, the city followed the trial with intense scrutiny. Social media amplified every development, sharing clips of the evidence, summaries of testimonies, and detailed analyses of Halloway's past behavior. People dissected the visuals, noting the moments where Halloway's expression seemed unnervingly calm, even amused, as paramedics attended to Jason. Public outrage mounted, and the community demanded justice not only for Jason Cole but for the sense of betrayal that came from the realization that someone entrusted with authority could act with such disregard for life. Internal affairs revealed additional findings that added depth to the case. Past complaints of reckless driving, intimidation, and excessive force painted a pattern that had been ignored or minimized. Officers who had previously stayed silent now provided testimony, describing a culture of fear and loyalty that had allowed Halloway's behavior to go unchecked. The accumulation of these revelations made it increasingly difficult for the defense to maintain the narrative of an accidental collision. By the time the closing arguments began, the evidence left little room for doubt. The jury saw the crash as more than a tragic event. It was the culmination of reckless, dangerous, and possibly malicious behavior that had been allowed to continue for years. The trial had transformed from an investigation into a single incident to an exposure of a man whose personal thrill-seeking and disregard for life collided with his badge, leaving death and devastation in its wake. The city watched, horrified and riveted, as the narrative of Jason Cole's final moments unfolded with unwavering clarity, forcing everyone to confront the terrifying potential of unchecked power. The day of the verdict arrived with tension so thick it seemed to fill the courtroom before anyone spoke. Every seat was filled, the gallery crowded with reporters, friends, and strangers who had followed Jason Cole's story from the beginning. The prosecution presented a final summary, highlighting the cascade of evidence that painted Halloway not as a man who had made a tragic mistake, but as someone whose recklessness and detachment had directly led to Jason's death. Each piece of testimony, each frame of video replayed in the courtroom, reminded everyone of the cold amusement he had shown at the scene, a grim detail that refused to fade from memory. Halloway remained stoic, his expression unreadable, as the jury deliberated. Outside, the city waited, holding its collective breath. The story had already become more than a single tragedy. It had become a symbol of the dangers of unchecked authority, a cautionary tale about how someone trained to protect could be driven by darker impulses. Communities debated, protested, and reflected on trust, responsibility, and the fragility of life in the hands of those sworn to uphold it. Hours later, the jury returned. The foreperson read the verdict aloud, each word striking the room with the weight of inevitability. Halloway was found guilty of vehicular manslaughter with aggravated recklessness. Gasps, murmurs, and tears swept through the courtroom as the gravity of the judgment settled in. The man who had laughed as Jason Cole struggled for life was now stripped of authority, facing consequences that mirrored the magnitude of his actions. Jason's family, who had endured months of grief and uncertainty, experienced a bittersweet closure. While nothing could undo the pain of losing a son and brother, the verdict offered a sense of justice that had been agonizingly delayed. They vowed to honor his memory by advocating for stricter oversight of law enforcement, determined to ensure that no other family would face a similar betrayal of trust. For the city, the impact of that night lingered. The case prompted widespread reflection, policy reviews, and a renewed dialogue about accountability and ethics within law enforcement. Jason's death had left a scar, but it had also sparked awareness and reform. The haunting image of a cop laughing at a dying motorcyclist became a lasting symbol of vigilance, reminding the public that power without responsibility can be deadly. In the end, the story of Mark Halloway and Jason Cole served as both a tragedy and a lesson, a stark warning of the consequences when authority is misused, and the imperative for justice to prevail, no matter how delayed.